Good morning. Welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN AM for Monday, April 12th, 2021. And our top story today, the higher ed outlook moves to stable and cyber attacks still pose a risk to higher education. Joining me now to discuss this and a lot more, Rick Seltzer is an editor with Inside Higher Ed. Rick, so great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Great to see you too, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the outlook now for higher ed. We have the beginning of vaccinations now. We're in the month of April, so millions of Americans are getting vaccinated, although it's not reached everybody, but hopefully it will reach all different demographics. But Moody's just came out with a report about the higher ed outlook. I know you did a story on this. What's your analysis here?
Yeah, the bond ratings agency raised higher education sector as a whole, its outlook from negative to stable, and it had been negative for the last few years. I thought it was an interesting time to see that outlook rise. Not necessarily something that you wouldn't expect, given the fact that these institutions just weathered a year of incredible uncertainty, from the enrollment standpoint to lawsuits over tuition and whether tuition refunds should be offered for online education in cases where students thought they'd signed up for in-person education and suddenly were having to take classes online because of the pandemic. And so you have higher education coming off of this period of incredible uncertainty and maybe able to return to some of the things that have been its growth areas or revenue bread and butter over time. In-person classes, again, there's traditionally been a premium on those. Dormitories, housing fees are extremely lucrative for many institutions. Some institutions actually make more of their revenue on housing fees than they do on tuition dollars. So any cuts to housing capacity that we saw in the last year hurt institutions. Any potential for returning to them, that's a very good thing. And then the other thing you have contributing to this stabilized outlook for higher ed is that the federal government just pumped a ton of money into colleges and universities. The federal relief funds were a big help. And then you have financial markets for institutions that have substantial investments. Financial markets have done quite well in the last year in many cases. And state economies in many cases are also seeming to climb back up. So if you look at that top level higher education question, that outlook is quite good. Within that, there's a little bit of bifurcation, or in some cases, a lot of bifurcation. You can probably expect the large public flagship institutions and those private institutions that you've heard of to outperform the smaller, either regional publics or private institutions that have just a brand known regionally.
So this really, so from the long-term perspective, we're still at the same place where it's kind of the haves versus the have-nots, right? The smaller universities facing financial constraints are still facing some level of financial constraints because they don't have the resources that the larger organizations do, and there's still possibility of consolidation, right? So we're talking about community colleges, smaller private colleges, right? That there's still some risk there, but by and large, in totality, things are looking better. And so when the outlook is better, the cost to borrow is actually better. So these institutions can borrow at a better rate than they could if their rating were lower. I mean, that's just economics.
That's right. And it's one of those cases, right, where the improved outlook and investors looking at this sector as something that's safer to lend money to can actually help it be safer to lend money to and help these institutions do better. There is still significant uncertainty about which institutions are going to do better than others in the future. I think that's a story that is largely unwritten for some places. I think strategy will still matter. And I think student behavior that's undetermined will still matter. I mean, there is real potential for demand shock. You bring up community colleges. There were a lot of students that probably otherwise would have enrolled this year that did not. I think the question going forward is, do some of them enroll a year later? And then you also have the rising high school class and the groups that normally would enroll this year, or is that spread out a little more? So I think the demand shock question is going to be a really important one to watch too.
Are you seeing more colleges and universities have kids, return to that in-classroom? Look, that's the preference, right, for everyone. Are you seeing these kids return to the classroom? Are you seeing enrollments in the second semester and spring semester kind of go up? Maybe it's too early to tell.
It is early to tell. There are some early indicators that kind of said the things that we saw in the fall were more or less continuing as far as overall enrollment, both online and in person. Kind of the lagging places were continuing to lag. Community colleges still took it on the chin. You didn't see a ton of recovery there. As far as looking forward, there is huge optimism, I would say, that places are going to be in person in much greater number, probably with larger density. Now, that all hinges on the vaccine, and most of these institutions will say that it hinges on the vaccine and infection numbers. But as of right now, the outlook is very good. The caution I would add to that is that around this time last year, we also got a bunch of press releases in our inboxes that said we will be in person in the fall. And that didn't always turn out particularly well for institutions.
Yeah, I think maybe a lot of that is, and believe me, it's not just in healthcare, higher education, it's everywhere. I think people want to return to some level of normalcy. They want to be in person, whether it's at the conference. I know you go to conferences, I go to conferences. If it's, in person working, the ability to work in person, I think we all want that. I think it's just kind of this stepped approach, and I think it's always good to be positive and optimistic. Rick, what is the impact of the vaccination? The vaccinations, are schools going to require kids to be vaccinated? And I know I read somewhere that Rutgers University is requiring students, because they're growing adults, to be vaccinated. But that's a public school. That's not a private school. So anything on the tea leaves there?
Yeah, it's very early days. One of the big associations just put out a set of guidelines that is really more like here are the things you should consider if you are a college president and thinking about requiring the vaccine. If I had to guess right now, I would say the needle is probably pointing to more places requiring it than not requiring it. But I believe some states, I think Florida, there's been some discussion about actually restricting public institutions from requiring the vaccine. So it's one of those things that it'll probably be on a very case-by-case basis, or maybe a state-by-state basis, maybe regionally. But as of right now, I think the needle's probably pointing to more places requiring it than not requiring it. And that, hopefully, for institutions' sake, opens up a lot of certainty. If you can have a certain percentage of your student body vaccinated, maybe you don't have to worry quite so much about having outbreaks on campus that we are still seeing that are requiring some places to suddenly suspend in-person instruction or lock campuses down.
Yeah, and that's costly. I know I have a friend of mine who has a son, and he developed COVID, had to be put in a hotel, separated from his dorm room. Obviously mentally horrific, but also physically and healthcare, from a healthcare perspective, horrific. So there's a lot of cost to some of those contingencies. Certainly having people vaccinated would eliminate the need for some of that, although we don't know the length of time that you're vaccinated for. A lot more to come on that, but it is a balancing act. Rick, I want to go to a very quick break. When we come back, we'll talk to Rick about some of the cyber attacks going on in higher education and what they may mean long term. You're going to want to stay tuned right here on BRN AM. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms, especially for the smaller businesses? I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network.
Are you stuck with a low credit score? A credit report and score that's causing you to be denied credit or pay higher interest rates than others for the same things? Then do what Terrence did and call Credit Repaired for your free credit evaluation to help restore your credit.
I started thinking about buying a new house, and my score wasn't where I needed it to be. I called and spoke with one of the representatives, and we just had a good conversation, and I liked what he was saying.
Just one call for his free credit evaluation was all it took to start back on the track to repairing his credit.
I'm seeing the deletions and I'm getting the report, so I know something's being done. It does make a difference to me.
All it takes is one call to get started.
Credit Repair has given me a second chance to have a better credit score.
Don't let a low credit score hold you back another day. Do what Terrence did and make the call for your free credit evaluation.
Call 800-819-4152. That's 800-819-4152. Again, 800-819-4152.
Welcome back. We're talking to Rick Seltzer of Inside Higher Ed. Rick, thanks so much for staying with us this morning.
Thank you for keeping me on.
So let's talk about some of these cyber attacks. I've been reading, I think, Stanford, UCLA, probably others. I don't want to just out those folks that have suffered some cyber breaches. But this has some real implications for higher education and learning in general. What can you tell us?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a long list of places. If I rattled them all off here, we'd be here for a while, and we'd all probably have wandered away, and I'd still be going. But it's everywhere from institutions that are drawing locally you probably haven't heard of, or you haven't heard of them unless you're in their backyard. Central Piedmont Community College in North Carolina, Millersville University in Pennsylvania, all the way to places like the University of California system, University of Miami. You mentioned Stanford School of Medicine. So it's a long list. I think one of the big questions that we don't know, and in some cases the institutions may not know, is how many more of these are out there? Because sometimes these institutions or their data systems or their contractors can be compromised, and it doesn't come out until much, much later. And so we're seeing places that were compromised weeks or months ago, and their information is in some cases showing up on the dark web, right? The Onion browser or somewhere else where you can see samples of it supposedly for purchase. Or in some cases, they're being hit in ransomware attacks, which are attacks where someone installs software that allows someone to lock down a system, and the institution cannot access that system until it pays a ransom. In some cases, those ransomware attacks are paired with information being dangled on the internet or on the dark web. And if you don't pay a ransom, supposedly the hacker will say, well, we'll release this, or we'll sell this publicly. There's one other kind of good old fashioned cybersecurity threat we've all probably seen that was recently warned about, and that is email phishing. Recently, there was an alert that went out. It was actually from the IRS, because it was a series of emails that were impersonating the IRS, and they were targeting anyone with a .edu email address, talking about tax refund payments, and it was a phishing scheme. The IRS put out a bunch of information about if someone has tried to file a tax return in your name, along with that alert. So probably that seems to be what they were getting at. I think that's a different level of institutional threat than those attacks we started talking about, the ransomware attacks. And the FBI recently issued some statements about increased ransomware attacks against colleges and universities. I think that right now is the part of this cyber threat that we're most watching, because it seems to be the fastest developing.
Yeah, and what I've learned, we had an expert on last Friday about talking about cybersecurity. What I've learned is that these folks, when they penetrate, they lay dormant, like almost like a cicada, but not for 7 years. They lay dormant for 6 months, 8 months to learn who you are, what you do, who your network is, and to kind of figure out how best to utilize what they have infiltrated. What are the implications here, Rick, for higher ed? Does this pose credit risk, but also reputational risk, I would think?
It is credit risk, it is reputational risk, and in some cases it may even be revenue risk or expense risk too. You know, one of our reporters, Lindsay McKenzie, who covered an attack, this attack was not actually, as best as we can tell, the direct fault of any college or university. It was actually traced to a security flaw in file transfer software that they were contracting out from another company. And she reviewed a trove of documents that seemed to have been taken in this attack. And it included academic transcripts, medical records, research grant documents, and employment contracts. If those things get out to anyone who wants to use it, maybe to file a tax return or for any other reason in other people's names, it could be a very serious reputational risk. Data security and privacy and ownership of our own information is a real stress point in our society right now. I don't have to tell you that. So if institutions cannot be good stewards of this information, there is potential backlash from the folks who are their employees and their consumers. Those are students and families. There's also a threat in that if a system is locked down that is required for operations, that's particularly important right now when so many classes are online, but it could even be important for an institution that is totally in person, holding all classes in person, but uses an online system for course registration. Hackers have been known to compromise and potentially install ransomware on course registration systems. So spring comes around, I am a rising senior and I need to enroll in that one class so that I can get my final credits and graduate on time. And all of a sudden the system crashes. That's not very good for me. That's not very good for the reputation of the institution. And it could have real long-term effects on how I view the institution and the sector as a whole.
Any idea about the prioritization? We talked in the last segment about financial, and certainly that's the lifeblood of any business, including higher education, which is a business. What are the implications here? Because if you're spending money on beefing up your virtual learning, you're doing the usual capital expenditures on staffing and enrollment and getting out and recruitment, but now you've got to allocate more and more of your budget towards cybersecurity. Like other businesses, again, this is no different than a regular corporation or a government. This has longer term financial implications for these organizations, these institutions. And I would think, Rick, and this is a long-winded question, but I would think that the smaller institutions are actually more vulnerable, just like smaller municipalities and towns.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think in many cases that's true. Smaller institutions just don't have the capital budget, especially stressed institutions. The flip side of that is sometimes the large institutions have more points of entry, right? They're contracting with more people, and one system might get hacked that compromises 500 or 1,000 people of a 10,000 person university. It's not risk across the institution, but it's a very risk concentrated on one group of people. I think there are a couple things going on here. I think one question is, what processes can institutions implement that really don't cost anything other than behavioral changes? We talked about phishing attempts and .edu email addresses. Testing whether people get caught up in phishing attempts or fooled by them is nothing new. There are many organizations that have been doing that for many years, trying to steel your spine against those. That's something that doesn't necessarily have to be particularly expensive. And then there is a whole set of cybersecurity contracts or products that you could look into, and building your systems to be more resilient against this kind of thing. I think one of the ways I would view that is a question of, do you want to spend a set cost now or potentially spend an unknown, potentially larger cost in the future? I saw some data from the Poneman Institute. The average cost of a data breach in higher education was $3.9 million in 2020. that's probably not going to get smaller going forward. I don't know exactly what group of institutions it was, if it was a small set of institutions or a large set, but for some of these smaller places, $3.9 million is a very substantial sum of money. And if you're looking at potentially spending that in the future, maybe it makes more sense to spend whatever you can now to kind of steel your spine.
A lot of pressure, a lot of financial pressure, a lot of pressure to maintain data. And I know a lot of people doing a lot of great work at these institutions to prevent a lot of these things and to shore things up financially. Rick, we're going to have to leave it there. Always great to talk to you. Great stories again this week. We look forward to having you back again very soon.
Thank you. I will look forward to being back.
And that wraps up this episode of BRN AM. Have a topic of interest, someone you think we should talk to, then drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the information in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, so much more, all in one place, check out today's edition of our newsletter and, of course, our website. We're back again tomorrow, so until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.
Waiting here for you to take and drink of. But if you're tired for the same.
Are you being audited and do you owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes? Is the IRS threatening to take more of your money? Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. The IRS can freeze your assets and seize your bank accounts, but you can stop these IRS actions. The Tax Doctor will work with you using our years of experience to represent your case to help you get the best resolution under the IRS guidelines. Help is here to deal with the IRS to reduce your stress. We've handled thousands of cases, so we know what we're doing. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a Tax Doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.
Call 800-224-6439.